So today's theme, as marked in your book, is God's promised salvation has come. And as I was mentioning in prayer this morning, this is not some sort of cosmic pivot. God didn't go, oh man, they sinned. Now what do we do, Andrew? Andrew wouldn't have a clue, and I wouldn't have a clue. But God, in his wisdom and providence, set out from the very beginning a plan of salvation, a miraculous plan of salvation. And you've heard me speak before, there were 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. 400 years of darkness and silence. Remember I spoke here on light, how the light broke into that place of darkness. Well, today it's going to feel like a little bit of a recap, and it's also going to feel like, wait, how did we get into December? Well, why are we talking about nativity today? Well, it's an important place. Every story has a beginning. So we have to begin at the place where Jesus came into the world. But I should say that Luke is an interesting character. So if you witness an accident at the corner of Adelaide and Beale, if it involves my car, please just ignore it. But you witness an accident at the corner of Beale and Adelaide. On each of the corners of that, on north, south, east, west corner, is a witness, a person who sees the accident. When the police show up after they wipe the donut crumbs from their face, no, just kidding. When the police show up, they are going to want to talk to the witnesses, aren't they? The stories that they get from 4 people are not going to be identical. They're not. In fact, the police, if they find identical stories, will immediately, according to their training, think there's collusion going on here. Somebody has sat somewhere and got their stories straight, aligned their stories. We want to see 4 different stories about the same thing. You tracking with me? It's the same event. The accident is the same event, but the person on the north side saw a license plate that had broken off and was on the ground attached to a bumper that the person on the south corner did not see. They're going to mention it in their report to the police. You following along? This means yes. Perfect. That was an old trick from my days as a youth pastor. If I wanted a reaction, I'd say, this means yes. No, wrong. There you go. So, Luke is an interesting character, though, because he wasn't one of those eyewitnesses. He sets out to write a book, to write down what he has heard. So he's a doctor. Doctors are very methodical. Well, they should be. A good doctor is very methodical and wants to know all the stuff before putting some thoughts together on paper. So that's what Luke is doing. He's interviewing tons of people. He's asking all sorts of questions. And he's compiling a book, and a letter, actually. We know it as a book, but it was a letter for him to a gentleman. And this was if you think of it as the book of Luke, the letter from Luke as a thesis, he's trying to prove something. He's wrapping all of his thoughts together, all of his exploratory interviews together, putting them in one document, sending them forward so that people know. In fact, he says that, doesn't he? He says that it seemed good to me to write an orderly account. Dr. Luke talking, to write an orderly account that you may have certainty, that you may know certainty. Don't we all want to know certainty? There's an expression out there that drives me nuts right now. That's my truth. And it's kind of said like this. That's my truth. There is no your truth. Sorry to break it to you. There is one truth. One truth. And that truth is Jesus' truth. Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, right? So Luke is setting out to do this. And he's setting out to do this at a very interesting time. After a 400-year period of darkness, suddenly these words. Certainty. Luke wants us to know something with confidence, doesn't he? God keeps his promises all the time. Heaven breaks his silence in Luke chapter 1, and Luke begins not with the king's palace. If we were writing the story, we might start there, right? A king coming. Well, let's have him born in a palace. Let's have the queen in a room with her maidens giving birth to this. That's not how Luke records the start of this. He actually goes back a little further back and gives us some context. And he talks about a gentleman, his name is Zechariah. And Zechariah was a priest. He and his wife Elizabeth were righteous, they were faithful, they were devoted, but they were childless. And in those days, in that culture, childlessness carried a stigma, disappointment, quiet grief. And then, suddenly, into that story, Zechariah and his wife sitting on the couch. Comes an angel. Don't think of yourself as an angel. And it wasn't a text message that he got, but comes an angel letting him know. Gabriel announces that Elizabeth, after all these years, will bear a son, and his name will be John. We'll know him further on down the road as John the Baptist, but John, who will prepare the way of the Lord. The silence has been broken. And Gabriel then appears again to Mary, as we know from the Christmas story, and she's not royalty, she's not influential, she's not even powerful. She's a quiet handmaid. But she is favored. And God comes to her through Gabriel and tells her that she's going to give birth. We know that story, right? How she's going to give birth to a person who will become a savior. Mary's response is not defiance, but surrender. When she says, it's not like a typical teenager would answer a parent who asks them to do something, and from a position of defiance. You do know that I'm a virgin, right? Like, did that escape you? Not that way. She says, this is crazy. I'm a virgin, but what you say is going to happen, it's going to happen. I'm honored, I'm privileged to be able to do this. We're reminded again that nothing with God is impossible. It's not just unlikely, it's not just difficult, it's impossible to think about those things surrounding Mary. But we know that with God, nothing is impossible. So salvation begins not with human striving, they've been in the dark, but with divine initiative. God takes the first step. God steps in. Man hasn't pulled him in over in 400 years of darkness. It's God stepping in. We should be really happy about that. A humble king is born in Luke chapter 2. We're progressing through our four chapters. If you were writing a story, as we said, of God entering the world, you would stage it differently, wouldn't you? Luke tells us that Caesar Augustus was issuing a decree and a census was required. So Jesus, born in Bethlehem, is going to have to do some traveling with his parents, and all those things is really, really neat. Do we say the word neat nowadays? It's cool. To look at the Old Testament, look at the story of the New Testament as recorded by Luke, and you remember in the days before computer screens on whiteboards in school, we had overhead projectors. You remember overhead projectors? Okay. So an overhead projector, the way it worked was a piece of, is that Mylar? You're a teacher. Clear, translucent, transparent paper, not paper, plastic, was put down, and it had, the teacher could write on it, or it was pre-written. Okay, so picture the Old Testament prophecies of Jesus coming on a piece of Mylar that's thrown onto an overhead. Luke's story sits exactly on top of that. It's really neat, a cool exploratory thing to do in your own time, to see where Luke's story of the coming of the King lines up with those like this. It's not like this, and it doesn't require squinting. It's evident what's going on. God is orchestrating this whole thing. We would have to spend hours and hours and hours and maybe a lifetime trying to get it to mesh. But God, because it's his plan, everything aligns. So Jesus and Mary and Joseph, they have to travel around a little bit because of the census, and they all the stories line up to the Old Testament. I wanted us to notice that when God decides to herald his message of a coming king, of his son that will be born, our story would have involved royalty in a kingdom with a king and a queen and a labor room and whatever. But that's not how God does it. God comes and he talks to the lowliest of people. You know, shepherds were not the employed elite. They weren't the computer programmers of that age. They weren't the doctors of that age. They weren't the lawyers of that age. They were considered by society to be one of the lowest places, one of the lowest vocations was being a shepherd. And that's who God chose to come to. He chose to come to the working class, the ceremonially unclean, the socially overlooked, and he said to them through the angels, "Fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy, which shall be to all people." All people. All people. You and I today. We're foreshadowed in that statement. That ought to bring a smile to your face. Because it wasn't just a message that was brought to a king and a queen and just those around them, but this was already a message that was going to include all people, you and I. This is Luke's heartbeat for the entire book. The gospel is not for the elite. It is expansive. The first worshipers at the manger were shepherds. The first songs are sung by angels. The first testimony spreads through regular, ordinary people. Salvation has arrived, and it's wrapped in humility. It's not a lot of pomp and ceremony, is it? It's not probably the story that we would have written, because it's not overly impressive. When you look at it, it's wrapped in humility. And then we see Jesus growing in wisdom and favor in Luke chapter 2 to 41 to the end of the book. Luke gives us a glimpse of his adolescence only one time. And he said that Luke recounts the story of when Joseph and Mary were looking for Jesus. He's disappeared from the caravan. And they go looking for him, and they find him in the temple. He's 12 years old, and they say to him, you freaked us out. I remember my son Joshua left us. He didn't leave us. He just got distracted in a mall in Toronto, right? You know that mall with the Ferris wheel in Rexdale? That's where he got lost, and we scattered to look for him. So I know that feeling. I know that feeling that Mary and Joseph would have had that day, looking in terror. They were terrified, looking for their son. They found him, and he answers softly, "Do you not understand that I have to be about my Father's business?" Throughout the rest of our talks, throughout the rest of the 5 weeks, we are going to establish, we are going to explore, and we are going to get into our hearts what his Father's business was. His Father's business was to bring peace, was to bring salvation. The Father will say to him, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," later on. And I want you to notice that, just as I close this morning, that God's promise, it was so interesting that we had to pivot this morning, because God's reaction was not a pivoting reaction. Sorry if I sound like a broken record, but we need to understand that this wasn't God pivoting after 400 years. He wasn't scratching his head in the dark for 400 years going, what do we do now? We gotta come up with something. No, that wasn't it at all. But in the fullness of time, the scripture tells us, when that was fulfilled in God's calendar, even though it was a long 400 years for mankind, when the fullness of time in God's calendar came, God stepped in. God said, "My son is coming." God said, the mission my son will have for his entire life will to bring mankind back into relationship with me. That's his mission. And it was established before he came. It was established in books like, in prophecies like Isaiah and other prophecies in the Old Testament. It was established. Jesus is the fulfillment, not a pivot.